Most matriculants around the country, I'm guessing, probably know now how they did in their matric exam. I'm sure the matric in your life does know. Now they know, they'll have an idea of what their options could be for next year. But for thousands of learners, they may have the marks, but they may still find it quite difficult to get into an institution. And you know how often issues come up around financing, paying to get into a higher education institution. So, what options are there for people, young people, who are in this position? Lindokuhle Xulu is an activist. Busisiwe Seabe is a student and youth activist. They join us now. Thank you both for coming in. I really do appreciate it, especially on a Friday afternoon. Busisiwe, let me start with you. Yes. I mean, so if someone does pretty well in matric, how difficult is it after that? And I'm particularly interested in people who come from maybe no fees paying schools. How difficult is it then to access an institute of higher education?
So accessing institutions of higher learning is very difficult in South Africa, especially depending on the class grouping that you belong to. If you're coming from a very disadvantaged, poor background, it's going to be a lot harder for you to access an institution of higher learning, because for the simple fact that there are only so many spaces available in institutions of higher learning, being public universities as opposed to private universities, right? So South Africans, to a large extent, especially the poor, want to access public institutions because they have more funding opportunities there. But unfortunately, not everyone gets a space in these top-tier universities that me and Nkululeko have been fortunate to be at.
And I mean, what this boils down to, Lindokuhle, is that actually there's competition for space, right? There's competition, and in some cases, I mean, you will have 10, 20 people applying for every position available.
Yes. SMU got around 40,000 applications. They only have 1,000 space for 1,000 students.
That's medical school, right?
Yes. It is estimated that around about 700,000 matriculants who wrote matric, but there's only 200,000 spaces at institutions of higher learning. Then this tells you that the demand for higher education exceeds the infrastructure that is there. It exceeds the capacity that is there in higher institutions of learning. But the question, how did we get there? We got there because pre-1994, the universities that we have were not designed for for everyone in society. Were only designed for a particular race and a particular segment of our society. And our failure in a democratic state was to then build universities that will be equal to the demand post 1994. And that has been a serious problem, because now those who were previously disadvantaged are still very much disadvantaged in this situation. For instance, you will have a majority of public schools releasing their result after the independent school have released their results, and the kids from independent schools will have space before the kids from public school have space in universities. So that puts those who come from poor backgrounds at a serious disadvantage.
I mean, I've just taken the time while you were talking to look on Google. In Britain, which has a similar population to ours, I think there are about 10 million more people, has 164 universities, and we have a grand total of 26.
Yes.
I mean, but I don't think we're taking into consideration that not everyone is able to access a university, but then there are institutions like TVET colleges that are available. South Africa has approximately 50 TVET colleges with over 264 campuses across the country that are able to capacitate, to a large extent, the students that can't go into universities. But unfortunately, when it comes to infrastructure, as he had mentioned before, those TVET colleges don't have the infrastructure that is necessitated to accommodate all these students, and that becomes a problem. So the issue is not necessarily about everyone accessing university, because let's be honest about it, not everyone is going to be able to qualify for a bachelor's degree or qualify to get in. But nobody is taking into cognizance the fact that TVET colleges are also available to young people. But also we must look at the role of government within, the TVET colleges space, right? In the sense of the infrastructure is dilapidated, there aren't adequate resources within those TVET colleges, there isn't funding to a large extent for many students to go there. So the education system, higher education to be specific, has a major crisis in South Africa. And if we don't resolve it, we're going to exacerbate the unemployment rate as we've already exacerbated it now.
We're also making other problems. I mean, sure, I'm lucky enough to have a university degree, and I do come from a particular race and during a particular time. But at the same time, all I do is talk for a living. It's the electricians and the plumbers, and I mean, I'm not going to mention the word ESCOM, but it's the people who actually do things that we need in our society, isn't it? We need people to do those things.
Yes. I think government has not done enough investment into a skills sector. there's been CETAs and all those initiatives aimed at increasing the skills, but government has not communicated the TVET space adequately, and has not dealt with the stigma that if you go to a TVET college, actually you are receiving sub-education than if you go to the university. So I think there's that gap in society that government has not done enough in terms of communicating, and society has not really took TVET education serious. So I think there must be a serious initiative to popularize the TVET space, because people think that post-education is a university education. But I think that you still have that space of TVET, but even our TVETs are not enough is to measure the demand that of higher education that exists in the country. And as far as they are not, even universities then are not enough, and the ones that exist are undercapacitated to deal with the demand. I think what we need to discuss, one, is a failure of government to deal with access to higher education post-1994, but also we need to really push for the investment in higher education and in education as a whole. But the also problem is that last year, for instance, we had the previous Minister of Finance decreasing the budget for education when we are facing all the issues that we are talking about. So I think as young people of this country, we need to prioritize campaigns around education, and we not only do it when it's January and it's this time of the year, but we need to seriously push government to invest a lot on education, and we need to fight for any attempt that can be made by government to reduce budget of education.
I mean, it's so interesting. I mean, sometimes I hate anecdotal arguments, but sometimes they explain something. Recently, I won't mention it, won't mention the name, drove past just assigned to an FET college. And it was this awful dirt road. And I thought, well, I'm not going to send my children there. You drive past the University of Johannesburg or UCT, they're palaces, you know. I mean, so they should be. And I think you're onto something. Is there also, within all of the dynamics, there's a need and a very strong, legitimate desire for families to get into the middle class, and the university education is seen as the way to do that?
Definitely. When you look at the historical context of South Africa, and you look at the haves and the have-nots and how that has permeated past 1994, you begin to understand why we have been conditioned as young people to believe that education is the only key to success, is the only key to achieving, you know, moving to a middle-class status. And unfortunately, that's not necessarily the reality that people on the ground are facing, because even students with qualifications aren't able to get employment. It means that the economy is unable to even absorb those that have qualifications. And also people that are going into universities, into TVET colleges, they're not necessarily prepared for those institutions, and this is why you have a lot of them failing, a lot of them repeating a lot of the grades, because they're not skilled enough or capacitated enough to be able to handle the pressures of institutions of higher learning, which goes back to our fundamental basic education system. So when you look at basic education, when you look at higher education, you begin to understand that this is a crippling problem that doesn't only start when you graduate and you get your matric results, but it starts from grade 1. The curriculum becomes a problem, and this is why to a large extent you have organizations like Fees Must Fall calling for the decolonization of the curriculum, not only at universities but also in basic education, because we understand the ripple effect that, you know, a crippled education system at basic level has on higher education.
One of the really important stories that I think came out of the matric results from yesterday and through until today were figures from the Minister, Angie Motshekga, this is Basic Education Minister now, talking about how the proportion of bachelor passes that come from non-fee paying schools has increased dramatically. It's now 60%. She made the point, if I understood the numbers correctly, that 15, 20 years ago, 60% of the people who got bachelor's passes came from 20% of the schools. Now, those were all fee-paying schools. We're talking really about the inequality. But once you get into a higher education system and you come from a background where perhaps you're the first person in your family or the first person in your community to get into a tertiary institution, it must be incredibly tough. You don't come from, even though you may have the same marks as someone who comes from a richer background, you're not really coming from the same space, are you?
I think one of the things that we need also to debate is whether or not there is coordination between basic education and higher education, or whether basic education speaks to higher education. Because in my view, it's totally different regimes. So you have a situation where you come from a basic education. When you get to higher education, it speaks about totally different things than you were studying in basic education. And others feel like they've wasted the whole 12 years. So our basic education does not properly prepare you for higher education. And that's the first thing. You need a well coordination. You need to speak to each other. You need these two forms of education to speak to each other. But more than above that, you also have a problem where children who come from private schools are well equipped than those who come from public schools. So the two-tier education system is a little bit problematic. But also, you don't have a government intervention that ensure that there's a coordination between the two. And you also have a problem about jobs post higher education. So what happens is that there's no coordination between the job market and higher education, but also there's no coordination between higher education and the basic education. And that is where government is missing it, in my view. You need government that is able to align the three, to speak to each other, so that when you go to a basic education, it prepares you for higher education, and higher education prepares you for a job market. Now you have a problem in the country where higher education, you can be educated, but when you go out of the market, what you have studied for is not in demand in the market. So how do you address that?
There's so many different things to look at. At the University of Cape Town, I think it was when Dr. Max Price was still the Vice-Chancellor, started a policy where no one who actually got in on academics would be denied access for financial reasons. The university found the money, and I'm sure that that policy is still the case. Are institutions doing enough things like that? I mean, UCT has got a, what's the American word, endowment, it's got lots of money. Are other institutions, government, doing enough to make that happen? I mean, it should be, and I know the NSFAS system from the outside, from what I see, is probably working better than it's worked in quite a long time. I mean, are we seeing it becoming easier, or are we seeing fewer people being denied access for financial reasons?
I mean, we're seeing a lot of people being denied access to institutions for financial reasons. We're seeing a lot of people being thrown out of institutions of higher learning because of historical debt as well, which is a large crisis that young people are going to be facing in February, in the first week when universities resume. And that becomes a problem. Although NSFAS assumes or paints a picture that there are available funds and there are funding people, the reality on the ground is that the people that need the funding aren't getting it. And this is where you find situations where someone will be funded for 1 year and not for the entirety of their qualification, which means you're only able to access university for a year, and then for the rest of the 2 years you have to find funding somewhere, and then you have to drop out because of the fact that you don't have funding. So the NSFAS system is not a system that is sustainable. And this is something that we had mentioned a long time ago during the Fees Must Fall movement, to say that we want to scrap NSFAS and we want free quality decolonized education. Because with free quality decolonized education, we're able to deal with the fact that 76.4% matric pass rate in the whole country is not enough. That is not adequate. That is a shameful statistic. To Angie Motshekga, for her to celebrate such a statistic is appalling. I mean, we understand that we're, the president has been called a boy recently, but when you look at the education system, you understand that it's being run by dibari, basically. This is what we call it in our African languages. We would say the education system is run by dibari in South Africa, because it doesn't even accommodate young people that aren't able to get matric certificates, those that fall at the wayside. What happens to those children that are left in corners, in townships, in Diepsloot, in Alexandra, that are, susceptible to social ills like drugs and gender-based violence? What happens to those young people? Those young people aren't absorbed into the economy. What happens to young women specifically who don't get, large access to institutions of higher learning? Because we have to look at the gender parity when it comes to entrance into university, and that's not something that's taken into cognizance. Yes, the university has...
More young women got better matric passes than young men this time.
But less young women are going to access institutions of higher learning. So the pass mark, or the rate of getting bachelor passes, doesn't translate into them accessing higher education and being able to complete their studies.
Lindokuhle, there's been a lot of heat about this, and I think in many societies, I think for lots of reasons. I mean, one is it's a story around the black middle class, to an extent, as I think we've already discussed. There was, during the NASREC conference, and I'll never forget, I was there when then President Jacob Zuma suddenly announced out of nowhere, more funding for higher education. People were quite cynical about that, I think correctly in my view. Do you get a sense that government is taking all of this seriously? Do you think in 5 years, 10 years, there's going to be a change, or are you worried it's going to be as it is now?
The problem is political will. When President Zuma announced free education, there was no commitment after him that he was correct. But the political leadership of the country has since contradicted him when actually the conference agreed with him. So that's another debate. But the political will is a serious problem. There is another thing to have a problem, but it's something else to have people who are willing to solve the problem. Secondly, I think as far as access is concerned, we still have a serious problem because a child that comes from the public school, the universities are running themselves and are not running according to, government does not have any control over universities, right? So NSFAS is having problems. It is trapped into serious corruption. It has been identified that there's some serious irregular spending at some point. There's some AG complained about NSFAS, right? But you are going to have a problem where universities are saying first come, first serve when they start. And what happens, the children of the rich will go pay and get space. So you are going to have a problem when those who come from public schools, no matter how nice they've passed, they are not going to get space because NSFAS is going to be late to accept them and give them space into universities. So that is another problem that you have, that the poor are discriminated unfairly. The higher education regime discriminates against poor black students.
Lindokuhle, Xulu, Busisiwe, Seabe, I really appreciate you coming in. Just the beginning of what's such an important conversation. Thank you both very much indeed. In a moment, Hugo Ribatika will have your sports.